My personal opinion is that we have to keep geoengineering on the table. We have to look at it very carefully because we might get desperate enough to want to use it. The danger, of course, with geoengineering is the one I was referring to a moment ago. We don't understand the system well enough to predict its responses in detail, and that means there's always a danger, if you try to engineer the system on a large scale, that you will do something that has side effects that are worse than the dimension of the problem you're trying to cure with the geoengineering in the first place. There are a variety of schemes that have been discussed for geoengineering. A classic example is injecting reflecting particles into Earth orbit that would deflect some of the sunlight that would otherwise be warming the Earth, and in that way try to produce a cooling effect to offset the heating effect of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases.
In addition, in an episode of the Colbert Report from Stephen Colbert, he interviews David Keefe specifically on solar geoengineering. What you're about to hear is perhaps one of the most vital information out there to this day, at least in my opinion, on geoengineering, coming from the man who is actually participating in this geoengineering program. Take a listen.
You could actually spray sulfuric acid in the stratosphere 20 kilometers over our head and use that to stop the planet warming up in a kind of ugly tech fix.
You can spray something into the atmosphere to change.
Spray pollution into the atmosphere to stop it warming.
How do you do this?
You'd start with a fleet of modified business jets and say 20,000 tons of sulfuric acid into the stratosphere every year, and each year you have to put a little more, and this doesn't, in the long run, mean that you can forget about cutting emissions. We will need to rein in emissions.
We'll get to it eventually. In the meantime, we're shrouding the Earth in sulfuric acid.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid.
We put 50 million tons of sulfuric acid in the air now as pollution, and it kills 1 million people a year worldwide.
Okay, but it'll be better if we put more in.
We're talking about 1% of that.
1% more, we're just killing 10,000 more people.
You can do math.
What happens to the sulfuric acid after it's sprayed? Does it just stay up there?
No, it rains down, but it's a tiny addition to what we're already doing.
Is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the end?
It actually turns out to be an old idea. This was known since President Johnson.
You ever look at those planes up there? They have contrails behind them. Maybe all those planes with the contrails, maybe they're actually spraying chemicals into the atmosphere right now and Uncle Sam isn't telling us.
Seems extremely unlikely.
That the United States is not telling something to its citizens? That seems extremely likely to me. Read the newspaper. I think they might have your idea already.
So there you have it. They came out publicly talking about solar geoengineering, and nobody seemed to care. And still to this very day, there's posts everywhere, news articles of them saying, well, we might, experiment with geoengineering, or yes, we are experimenting, but you never know the consequences, etc., etc., etc. Even though we see a similar aspect of what they call stratospheric aerosol injection happening in our skies almost on a daily basis, all you gotta do is peek at your window, look at the sky, and you'll begin to start noticing jets, whether it be commercial or military aircraft, spraying long-lasting lines that stretch from horizon to horizon that linger into a hazy, milky, gray-looking sky and clouds. Nevertheless, these same stratospheric aerosol injections are actually chemtrails. If you don't know what chemtrails are, I would recommend reading a book from a guy named William Thomas, an author of his book Chemtrails Confirm. In his book, he describes the differences of a chemtrail and a contrail, laying down all the facts of whether or not what we're seeing in the skies are actual chemical trails or condensation trails, with actual data from NASA and NOAA themselves. Surprisingly, William Thomas was actually the first man to popularize and promote the word chemtrails.
A chemical trail leaves a plume that stays in the sky for many hours, and chemtrails are rarely seen alone. What we most commonly see are X patterns, parallel rows, tic-tac-toe like grids in the sky, and of course airliners do not fly those kind of traffic patterns particularly over rural areas where they're rarely seen. So chemical trails last a long time, and another giveaway is that if the sun is behind them, we often see a prismatic or rainbow effect in the sky through those chemical trails, indicating, scientists have told me, indicating the presence of chemicals in the air.
Stratospheric well-back seeding for reduction of global warming, a process to reflect infrared energy back into space. And this patent called for chemicals to be sprayed into the greenhouse gas layer, wait for this, 22,000 feet and higher. What were they going to spray? Oxides of metal. Which oxide? Aluminum oxide. Now you're saying, well, that's a heck of a lot of airplanes, flying a lot of missions to spray that kind of material. So we turned to the United States Air Force, and you know what I found? They happen to own over 800 tanker aircraft, KC-135 and KC-10 aircraft. Exactly the planes that we have positively identified in hundreds of photographs and miles of videotape as the aircraft spraying these chemtrails.
You mentioned earlier that you're a pilot.
Yeah.
Talk about chemtrails. We hear a lot about that. What are those, and are they for real?
Well, when you look into that and ask questions, they say, oh yeah, contrails. No, contrails are behind a jet. If you see a jet flying very high, the stripe, the condensed stripe behind it, that's normal. But in areas first observed where there's very little population, you see a jet airplane going, it's not only one, they have 4 condensed stripes behind them. They go this way, this way, this way, this way, and then this way, this way, this way, this way. And when you inquire about it, ask people, you recognize that the real climate change scientists are truly ticked off, because apparently nobody really is asking them. It's the special interests, in my opinion, it's the oil industry, the energy industry, that are blowing smoke up somebody's you-know-what, and telling them that we have to lay a pattern up there to prevent sun energy from hitting Earth. And what they're doing in there, it's now pretty much determined. They're putting in there aluminum, barium, and strontium. Now you take these chemicals and run them through a PubMed literature search in respect to human health, you will find more than 3,000 papers. Aluminum alone, aluminum Alzheimer's, right, mental, there's no question about it. Now it so happens, when there were people who really paid attention, if there was due to some weather and air changes, wind patterns, suddenly this stuff that they're laying out there, it comes down in rain. If it falls on crops, it kills the crops. It's like they have big blisters on any one of the crops, vegetables or things like this. Organic crops, totally destroyed, can't even use them.
All 3 of these elements, if ingested enough by the body, could lead to health problems. For example, ingestion of too much aluminum may potentially cause Alzheimer's, as well as respiratory failure. Barium can have similar effects, like making you nausea or have a severe impact to your heart. And I can go on. The bottom line is that all 3 chemicals have some sort of major impact to our health if we ingest high levels of it, of course. And the thing is, every day, at least most of the time, they're spraying these things everywhere in the skies, exponentially, almost non-stop. And I think the point that I'm trying to get across is that how can we avoid all this ingestion of aluminum, barium, strontium from the sky, from these chemtrails, if they're spraying almost every day? And the thing is, all this lands on trees, the food, the oceans, the waters, the lakes, the plants, everywhere, even the insects.
About a third of the American food supply depends on bees. They help pollinate many crops, but the bee population is declining. This nature preserve in Chester County is trying to reverse that with a pollination garden to attract bees. But they'll face a new challenge as the U.S. Department of Agriculture suspends collecting data for its annual honeybee colonies report, an important tool for understanding the plummeting honeybee population.
What you would see is more desert than you would see healthy, vibrant landscapes. They're critical impact is on the food source.
Scientists say bee populations have been steadily declining for more than a decade because of parasites, pesticides, habitat loss, and climate change.
You know, it's pretty funny that mainstream scientists and media always tend to blame global warming or climate change for every disease or natural disaster out there that occurs on a daily basis. Yet they avoid anything else but CO2. For example, there's something called cirrus clouds. Cirrus clouds are induced by supposed persistent long contrails. These cirrus clouds trap heat, and in these cirrus clouds are soot and carbon black dust. In soot, there's aluminum, barium, and a whole bunch of elements in them that fall out and create these looking cirrus clouds.
Soot is filled with metals such as chromium, iron, molybdenum, sodium, calcium, aluminum, vanadium, barium, cobalt, copper, nickel, lead, magnesium, manganese, silicon, titanium, and zirconium. Considering that some fraction of soot can effectively act as an ice nucleating particle, and that a dominant fraction of ice residuals in cirrus clouds contain metal compounds, the presented findings support the assumption that aircraft engine emissions can act as ice nucleating particles, or cloud condensation nuclei, or just generically called a cloud seed.
If you're still in doubt that these trails in the skies aren't containing chemicals or particulates, I would recommend looking at the samples that I will present right now. Some of these samples contain high amounts of aluminum, barium, or even strontium, or even other elements just higher than their normal rate of level.
It is called geoengineering, fighting global warming by putting a chemical dust in the atmosphere and reflecting harmful radiation back into space.
You could use barium oxide, for example, which makes big fluffy clouds. You could use tiny little bits of aluminum, which is benign in the environment, and essentially manage the climate.
And what I found was unusual spiking since the early 1990s in barium, aluminum.
But Rosalind Peterson of California Skywatch says health department records show a sharp increase in both chemicals in the water supply of Northern California, dating from the time the huge contrails first appeared over her home in Mendocino County.
What's the significance of the barium and the aluminum?
I went and got all the tests, and all these things in the same test would be up way over state and federal standards. It had to be airborne, because how could it get to such diverse regions of our county? We have jets going in every direction. X's, east, west, north, south, circles. There is something going on in the air. I don't know exactly what, but I think there's some experimentation.
I would also recommend listening to David Keefe's presentations, as he himself and many of his other geoengineer lobbyists have explored the possibility of using aluminum and other elements for geoengineering.